now, in the 80th winter, I watch as the winds of life blow over me and leave me with little but dim recollections of the days I spent existing in this dark world. I have watched as an empire was built and then crumbled into ruin before my eyes with the distant interest of a spectator of some event not particularly to my interest. My name is Caricion, and I am the younger brother of the once great warlord called Calvath. I was born the second son of the barbarian chieftain Bruce Forlorn III in the forests of the East. Being the second born, my father took little interest in my upbringing, as Calvath was by tradition heir to this position. Upon cresting my 5th summer, I was sent to the monastery of the Moon Priests, where I was taught the ways of language, writing, and healing. The 3 churches were then ruled by the 3 chosen high clergy, who held the titles of Full Moon Priest, Half Moon Priest, and the Dark Moon Priest. I was allowed to return upon reaching manhood at the marking of my 14th summer. My father had already been slain by the great drake of the southern forest, and Calvath, a young man of 16, had taken his place as chieftain. Having studied under the cleric of the Dark Moon, I was allowed a position as spiritual advisor in my tribe and allowed to live in the longhouse of my brother. My return was silent and uncelebrated, as Dark Moon priests are not welcomed as freely as those of the other churches. This owing to the tales that we are versed in the ways of sorcery, although forbidden to practice them. My brother's reception was cold, as he had not been fond of me even in childhood. My frequent illnesses and fevers had made me a burden to our house, and the doting of our mother upon my frailty brought me only scorn from Calvath. "You may as well have been born a girl," he would laugh as he passed me, huddled in furs by the fire pit. "Your weak and soft hands will never grip a sword or pull the string of a longbow." I would bear such constant mockery in silence, and was far from saddened by my exile to the priests. My only regret was the abandonment of my sad and lonely mother, who passed unto death the following winter. In the days following my return, Calvath greeted me with a grim disdain and minimal respect. However, he dared not taunt me as he had in childhood, for fear of dream spells the Dark Moon priests may wield as tools of healing or defense. Full Moon priests are great healers of the body, Half Moon priests the workers of harvest and fertility, and the Dark Moon priests are given the realms of man's heart in which to work. As spiritual advisor, it fell on me to consult my brother in the choosing of a bride, a necessity to seal his dominion over the tribe. Maidens from all 6 of the neighboring tribes were brought to Calvath and given counsel with him in hopes he might choose one to marry. I had chosen a girl from the gatherers of the Dusk Plains as the most suitable, as she was beautiful and bright of disposition, promising warm company and a fertile body with which to produce sons. However, Calvath had eyes only for the pale, dark-haired girl who arrived from the cave country of the Dark Mountain, where the people were known to dabble in illicit arts and fight from the shadows in war like striking serpents. She had the look of intelligence and a wantonness of the flesh which Calvath found irresistible. Her dowry was ridiculous, and she had arrived in the company of 5 brothers whose looks were sallow and deathly as her own. "You will be paying a price for her pleasures, my brother," I had said in confidence over the table of our nightly dinner. His men, many much older than he, had laughed at my comment and urged that the price might well be worth its cost. "If you are to bed a girl, at least she should know how to ride in the saddle," our uncle had laughed with red eyes dim with mead. "Why take some frightened spring flower to the furs of marriage when you could plant your seed on a writhing vixen?" Such talk was typical of my uncle, who had wedded 7 brides and killed them all with abuse and endless childbearing. Unfortunately, he showed the fruit of close to 20 surviving sons, and his ignorance was as good as wisdom to the ears of Calvados. Then so be it. I will take her and her miserable wretch brothers as part of the dowry. They look a sickly lot, but I've heard tell they are deadly with daggers and bow. Calvados smiled beneath the sparse growth of his first beard as he gnawed at the roast oxen in his hands. Deadly for the poison they cover every blade and arrow, I sighed. Poison that could find its way into your mead horn all too easily, my brother. Don't you trouble yourself about my horn, he mocked as he nudged our uncle suggestively. Perhaps you should wed the flower girl from the Dusk Plain. Perhaps your horn should be wedded in her nectar. I may take no bride, I answered, hiding my bitterness beneath the cowl of my dark robes. That is right, my uncle roared, his huge belly bouncing with laughter. I hear tell the priest makes use of the boys they are sent for such pleasures. That is not true, I hissed with anger. Priests may couple with women, but we may not be wed. So, whores then, he said in a low, accusatory whisper, you may wallow in filth with the widows of dead soldiers, but take no bride of your own? It had long been a custom amongst our people that should a warrior die, his widow could make her body available for use in order to support what family she had left to care for him. It's true, Calvados stated, as mead spilled over his chin. He visits the widow of Grumshold at least once a fortnight for her wares. Better than boys, I suppose, my uncle said with disgust. And so Calvados' decision to marry Fierta of the Dark Mountain was made over a dinner of oxen and mead. Their wedding was carried out in the gray of winter before the blazing of the Yule bonfire on the equinox. 7 lambs were cut across the throat and tossed into the flames in sacrifice before the celebration was commenced. My brother rejoiced in the dancing and merriment before taking his bride to the furs of matrimony. That night the longhouse was filled with grunts and cries of their wedded bliss, and the slaves huddled laughing and joking in the far corner where their beds and my own were located. This union proved fruitful, and the chieftain's bride was declared with child by the midwives within a month. During her pregnancy she was showered with gifts and doted on by her servants, but she kept no counsel but for that which she partook with her thin, dark brothers. These 5 stalked about her like starving wolves, awaiting the sickened elk to drop in the snow. In the 3rd moon of her pregnancy, I had entered through the gate of sleep and into the mists of her dreamscape in hopes of finding some knowledge of her intentions. I saw only a world of dark caverns and dim light where shadows crept in the depths, which appeared far from natural or human. Calvados balked at my warnings and threatened to send me back to the priest if I were not to alter my suspicious nature. I had by then become less than resolute in my concern for the well-being of Calvados or my family, and so I merely watched in silence and waited for the next arrow to fly. The child was born near the end of summer the following year, and lo, it was a sickly and pallid little creature which cried endlessly and suffered from horrible fevers. The boy was given the name Faldor, which means proud fortress. If it had been any but the firstborn, then it would have been met with my fate and sent away. But being heir to Calvados and essential to his continuing role, it was necessity that it thrive. If only the thing would just die, Calvados had bemoaned over the fire of his hunting camp as the sickened child neared its 4th moon. You should not wish for such things, I answered. Not only is it wicked to speak so, but Fierta has already lost another, and the midwives say it may well be her womb is inhospitable to new life. Then that weeping thing would be my only child, he had said aghast. It has no strength in its lungs but for screaming. How will it even survive the winter? I looked into his dark, black eyes and saw the callous anger which had been so ever-present in our father's stare. Perhaps if you were to nurture the infant, it might find its strength. The full moon priests say that, as a rule, a child cannot grow without love, any more than a plant may flower without water and light. Bah! He slurred as he drank more of the strong winterberry ale imbibed during cold hunts. I was not nurtured, and I am as strong as a panther, whereas you were coddled like a pup by our mother, and you are still a sniveling worm. I listened now to his insults with amusement, as I pondered his perception of his own ignorance as strength, and my compassion as inherent weakness. Even so, it is your priority to assure the child reaches adulthood, or you will be without heir, and your title pass to Uncle Derrida's son. Buello? He is an idiot and a fool. So be it. We will make this poor wretch live if it wants to or not. As it would seem, the child was not wont for living, as it grew even frailer and sicklier. Over the next year, it was in the middle of frozen winter that I overheard a conversation between Fierta and my brother as they lay together upon the furs of their marriage bed. What shall I do with this wretched child in your barren womb? He said with disgust after rolling back from between her thighs. I am saddened that I brought you such disappointment, she replied calmly, and with the same timid yet scheming voice she always used in speaking with him. It is such a shame that your people have such binding laws against the arts, which we hold so practical in the Dark Mountain. She said this with a wistful distraction, but I heard the bait with which she was luring him, dripping on every word. What do you mean? He said as he reached for the meat horn, and finding it empty, threw it with disgust onto the floor. I mean only that we have many ways of strengthening those who are of weak blood. But these things, which are so simple and helpful, are unlawful here in the forest. What kind of things are you talking about? Herbs and potions, I suppose. Oh no, nothing that mundane and useless, but it is common knowledge that there are creatures which hold the powers of life and healing in their very life's blood. Well, name the beast. We shall bleed it dry, make this child strong. Calvadas had fallen to the lure without even the wisdom of a fish before the hook. That is the problem, my lord. It is no beast which carries these properties. Then what? The fairy are known to live forever, my chieftain, and there is knowledge amongst the sages of the Dark Mountain which have learning as to how to use their blood to make men strong. Sages of the Dark Mountain? What learning could there be amongst your pathetic people? You are correct, sir, my lord. We are a weak and pitiful kind, but there is an art which some practice, which would be of great use if employed in our dire circumstance. And how are we to consult these sages of yours? They are my brothers, my king. They are the 5 of the most learned men in our tribe. But they are bound by the restrictions of your ancestors. Ask them what we must do, and it will be done. Calvadas' voice was filled with the drunken confidence of Mead. If he had only known the wheel of sorrow he had set into motion, he might have cast the woman from his bed and let the throne fall to his cousin. But instead, within 3 days, a hunting party was called together, and the group left in the early morning to seek a prey not human, but certainly not of the animal world. You are insane! I yelled across the table as he stuffed his red, drunken face with hind. It seemed to me he had aged a decade. In the barely 4 years I had been cursed with his presence once more. He was haggard and dumb with drink and the excess of his wife's tainted flesh. He merely stared at me with his black, lifeless eyes as I stood shaking my fist in disbelief. We have no quarrel with the fairy. Do you not understand that these are not frail farmers with whom you are entangling yourself? This is sorcery with which you are dabbling, brother. It is forbidden by every law of the Holy Order of the Moon. You have sent your warriors to murder the innocent for the magic of their blood. Have you no mind? I have mind, he replied with the distant resolve of some idiot fiend. A mind to ensure that my son will claim my seat as chieftain, and a mind to not be chastised by such a fool as you, he said, throwing his horn of mead into my face. I grew silent in my humiliation, and left the hall to the scorn and derision of my brother's men. I walked alone into the forest and sat upon a stone in the light of the moon's sliver, weeping. That next day the hunting party returned, bearing a wineskin full of their quarry. Just a little at first, Fierta had said, as she took a small wooden bowl and placed it to the lips of the sickly child. Then, when he develops a taste for it, he can have more. She sat by the fire with Calvath, surrounded by her 5 grim siblings, who chanted strange words under their breath as the child sipped. The effects were almost immediate, and soon the color flooded young Faldor's face as he smiled happily at his mother, with her same dark eyes and same pale, thin lips. "It's good, isn't it?" she said to him kindly, as she offered him more. Soon he was sleeping, curled in a ball at her feet wrapped in furs. His endless weeping and coughing had ceased, as she gazed up at her husband with pride. "See, he is already growing stronger, and the more he drinks, the stronger he will become." Calvath was already senseless with drink, but still reached for his mead. "Wait, my dear," she said, stopping his hand before it reached the horn. "Perhaps you would like to partake of this potion. It makes one strong and virile in the marriage bed." She said this with the sly coyness of a dark predator. Looking surprised, but not too intoxicated and stupid to reject the offer, he took what was left in the bowl and drained it. Fierta's brothers stared, knowing, as Calvath looked on into the flames of the fire with wide, awakening eyes. "By the moon, it is like honey and fire," he said, as he traced his fingers along the bottom of the bowl and placed it to his mouth. "Indeed, you may have more, but you must save most for our child," she said, laughing, as he lifted her into his arms lustfully. "More? Yes, a hornful for me before we lie together," he said loudly to all who could hear. At night the sounds of their pleasure would last long into the morning. I looked on in horror, and then only saw the eyes of the 5 dark mountain sages watching me with arrogance. The wineskins would be empty in only 3 days. The child had grown strong and lively as he rushed around the hall, swinging at the slaves with a wooden stick as if it was a sword. However, Calvath had grown sullen and angry as he watched the last bowl of the fairy blood being served to the children. "We must have more," he whispered hungrily to our uncle. "You must take more men this time and bring back as much of this potion as you can carry." "But, my lord, you make it sound as if we can just ride up and fill the skins in a barrel," Dyrgida scoffed. But Calvath's eyes would betray no humor. He grabbed Dyrgida by the throat with tremendous strength, and pulling him down, snarled like an animal. "You will call the tribes together, and we will declare war then." Dyrgida searched the madness in Calvath's gaze for some sign of reason, but there was none to be seen. "War? But we cannot fight against the fairy," our uncle said, nearly whimpering as Calvath's grip threatened to crush his throat. "They have magic and power like you cannot imagine. The 3 we took were but children in the forest, and still they fought like panthers. We have no magic with which to beat them on the field." "That is not altogether true," Fierta said, as she slithered to her husband's side. "If my brothers are allowed they do have certain gifts which may help you in such a venture. Then it will be done, Calvadas said, releasing Deirdre and shoving him violently from his side. But for their magic to be at its peak, they will require sustenance, she said, until Calvadas' ear, she gave him a knowing and frightening glance. Let them eat! They can have anything from the larder. Let them feast until they are too fat to move, but bring the Bloodwine! The food that they will require is not that which you have in your larder, my lord, she said as she ran her hand over his chest and kissed his bearded cheek. Then what? Blood, my lord. They will need blood. He turned and gazed at her for a moment, his breathing becoming irregular and haunted. Up until that very moment, Calvadas, under the influence of the Bloodwine, had indulged every fancy that his bride had proposed, even to the point of transporting massive stones quarried from the cliffs and ridges of the Dark Mountain. By now the monoliths ranged far and wide over the expanse of my brother's kingdom as proclamations of his devotion to the culture of his bride. What kind of blood? A few slaves should suffice, she said. This as plainly as if she had requested him to butcher a goat for a feast. Calvadas was silent, and I saw for the first time turmoil in his black, desperate eyes. Human blood? He whispered to her, as if pleading for her to break her silence and laugh. That's a morbid joke. Send 3 of the slaves into the forest glade tonight. No one will know the better. But people, he whispered like a frightened child. They are only captured enemies, correct? She questioned with false naivety. But we are sworn to keep them in peace. It is our way, he replied as she stroked his cheek. So much compassion. You are sworn not to drink the blood of the fairy as well, she answered with condescension. He looked down at his trembling hands, and I could see that the blood wine had awakened a horrible thirst in his heart, a thirst which he felt he could not live without. So be it. And I left the hall intent on never returning. I waited long in the forest, near him not to light a fire and signal my whereabouts. I huddled in a small cave for many hours, intent on spying the ritual of Fierda's brothers and stopping it, if at all possible. The night came upon me as I shivered and made my way by the moonlight to the village, watching as 3 slave girls were told to go into the woods alone. The girls could not question the commands given to them, and they seemed almost on the verge of tears as they made their way down the path towards the open glade, some distance from the village circle. I held a bow in my hand and followed to the open meadow where Fierda's brothers were waiting beside a giant roaring fire. I believe that the girls had thought that they were to pleasure the men, and even though frightened, seemed resolved to perform the task and thereby avoid punishment from their lord. They walked dolefully to the fireside and removing their winter coats as the 5 gangly and sullen men approached in the dark, ragged garb of the mountain people of the caves. The men circled behind them and began undoing the girls' garments and letting them drop to the snow, and soon the 3 girls shivered naked as they were fondled and caressed by the brothers. I had readied an arrow in my bow when I saw the first sign of change taking place amongst the dark mountain clan members. The girls had closed their eyes and did not see as the limbs of the 5 began to lengthen and strange movements began beneath their gray tunics. Their flesh hardened into shining black armor as round orbs appeared on their foreheads to match the small ebony spheres of their eyes. Their clothing was ripped to shreds as several long branch-like appendages burst out from their sides, and I beheld the sight of 5 giant scorpions falling upon the maidens in sudden bloody madness, gripping the screaming girls' heads with their horrible mandibles. They pierced their soft flesh with the dagger-like protrusion from their extended, lashing tails to inject a foul toxin which rendered the slaves motionless. Then, crawling over the pale, still flesh of the girls, I watched as they began to feed. The longbow fell from my frozen hands as I began to flee through the forest towards the great road. I would run for hours until I fell in the snow. Then, dragging myself to my feet, I began a sojourn through the cold of winter back to the monastery from whence I had come. Many times I had almost died on the road, but I had sent a message through dreams to the high cleric of the dark moon, and as I lay on the brink of death, I was found and brought to the church. 3 fingers on my right hand and 2 of the other would be lost to frostbite, as well as a toe and my left ear. It would be weeks before I would be able to speak of my experiences in the land of my kin, but by then the news had already reached the high priests that Calvadas had amassed an army and was marching as a scourge toward the lands of the Highland Elves. This would begin a long and bloody conflict which would endure for decades as Calvadas' tribe formed into the first human empire, and as the thirst for blood spread over the tribes, went about devastating and conquering much of the known world. Calvadas would rule without the effects of aging or death for the better part of the century, as I eventually rose to the position of high cleric, and then withered to an ancient husk behind the walls of my church. In time, my research would uncover many hidden truths that alluded to the events of what had occurred in my homeland during my youth. The people of the Dark Mountain had long been in thrall of several demonic entities, which they had come to worship through incest, cannibalism, and sacrifice. This degradation had occurred over many generations, unbeknownst to any in the outside lands. It was revealed to the tribal sorcerer priests the powerful magical component use of fairy blood, and a plan was formulated to enslave these enchanted people in order to create a horrible race of monstrosities with which to conquer the world. But despite the power of Calvadas' armies and the magic of the black scorpion sorcerers, he could in time fail as his insurgent forces were deterred by the combined might of the elven witches. Now, in the twilight of my days, reports have come to me of the fate of my brother. Alone in the great fortress named Falgor, after the son who was to be its heir, and driven mad by his addiction to the Bloodwine, his wife and her brothers had taken to drinking the blood and eating the flesh of his own people. A rebellion had occurred, and the great General Calvadas was burned on a stake, tied to the hideous creature he had wed. As for the fate of his only son, he came to me, seeking sanctuary some 10 years ago. It took nearly 3 years for him to become weaned from the Bloodwine, but after his recovery, he has also become a priest of our order and is expected to follow me after my demise as the head of the Church of the Dark Moon. Calvadas had given me an heir instead.